Welcome to the Cycling in Alignment podcast, an examination of cycling as a practice and dialogue about the integration of sport in right relationship to your life.
Peter, welcome to the Cycling in Alignment podcast. Thank you so much for making time to sit down and have a conversation with me today.
My pleasure, Colby. I'm really looking forward to this.
So we met, for context, we figured this out on email the other day. We met at I believe it was Chip Chilson's camp in Moab in probably
Bob Roll, yeah.
Yeah, 2014, 2013?
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that?
It was, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Almost a decade or almost a decade ago.
Yeah. And that was a great camp. I attended that as a coach, and I really like Chip's camps. I think that they are quite unique because they're not just about bike riding and, you know, that's it. Then you go and sit in your hotel and drink wine or eat food or whatever. He really tried to make a more enriched experience for the people attending the camp. And he brought in people like you, and he brought in a guy who was a spine doctor. He brought in a couple strength and conditioning coaches, and it was really off the bike. There were things to do, right? We did stretching sessions. We did breath work. We worked with Ed Harold on breath work. He taught me a lot about breath. I actually met with him a few times after that camp. And we got to learn from you about your product, which is called Vespa. So if you would, please unpack what your product is for our audience. Help us understand what Vespa is.
You also, and as you know, I also talked as much about the whole concept behind Vespa, which is optimizing your fat metabolism, which Vespa, I never sell Vespa as a one-trick pony magic bullet tool. It's one tool of many. And I think that that's really important. That what's really nailed me is this whole idea of if people can step back from what they're hearing, the messaging they're getting, and just think of a very simple, biologically sound, evolutionary, developed concept that if you think about it, we have virtually limitless stores of calories as fat on us, and we have very limited stores of glucose and glycogen. And to a point, that's part of the marketing message of pushing a lot of high carbs is you only have a very limited amount of glycogen. But from an evolutionary standpoint, that doesn't make sense, because why would you be burning through your fight or flight fuel? That's what glucose and glycogen are. It's your fight or flight, and it's also a bridge energy for when you change your physiological state of say you go from being sedentary to active. Glucose also bridges that gap. So it's a fight or flight, and it's a bridge fuel. And that fat should be your aerobic energy source, because, as I say, primitive man didn't get up in the morning, have a bowl of oatmeal, grab a couple of gels, his spear, and go hunting. You know, he had to go out and hunt and gather and perform as if his life depended on it, because it actually did.
Yep.
And so if people can really ponder and get curious about that concept, about where we came from, where we evolved from, what we were created to do before the modern construct, that concept of using fat as your majority aerobic energy source makes a lot of sense. And then they have to think about, okay, the messaging has all been about carbs, performance. And we're not suggesting for a second you eliminate carbs. We use plenty of carbs in our diet for both performance, adaptive stresses, and all that. But we're not using this message where you're pushing tons and tons of carbs, because the other thing people don't connect the dots is, as far as your physiology and metabolism is concerned, all those concentrated forms of carbohydrates essentially boil down to sugar, glucose.
Yep.
And so that's the start of it. And then Vespa, the product, is something I came across in 2006, a month out from me running my first 100-miler, which was Western States. And when a friend of mine, Paleo Paul, threw me a couple pouches, he said, "Hey, try these. My friend Mojo swears by them." And Mojo is this cyclist who's he's a psychiatrist, but he's a pretty brilliant guy, but he's also a really good athlete. And at that time, a couple of years earlier, he rode a fixed gear bike across the United States.
Okay.
And the Vespa was like his go-to. And so I used the Vespa at the Western States and had an excellent run in a year that only half the field finished. It got really hot and there was just a lot of carnage. I was able to finish under 24 hours, basically not really knowing what I was in for. And that got me going on the whole thing. But Vespa is actually an accidental discovery of nature, much like penicillin, right? Some Japanese entomologists were studying the Asian giant wasp, known commonly to your people because of the media as the murder hornets, right? You got to add a little bit of hyperbole. And this is the largest of the hornet species or wasp species. And it flies 60 to 100 kilometers a day, attacks, kills, and masticates its prey. It's an apex predator into a food ball, and then carries a third of its own weight in that food ball back to the colony to feed to the larva. And the larva gives it this bioactive peptide that triggers the wasp to be able to access all the fatty acids that are stored in the thorax, the back part. Bees, ants, wasps, and termites all have this thorax. What it is, it's a reservoir of fatty acids that this precise symbiotic relationship between two life stages called trophallaxis accommodates that. And so what happened was they're like, wow, this is incredible. And then they hypothesized, because animal cells are like 97, 98% the same across species, that this peptide would have the same biological effect on other animal cells. So they tested on rats and mice swimming to exhaustion. And when that showed efficacy, they actually took longer to swim to exhaustion. And they measured things like glucose, fatty acids, all these kind of things when they were doing these tests. Then after that, they tried it on humans, and sure enough, they were getting the similar results. And anecdotally, observationally, over the last 23 years of it being on the market, that's what we've been seeing. And I think at this point, that data set of real world accomplishments, and the athletes are all saying there's something to the Vespa that allows them to be, it allows them to reach their potential more. They feel like it's really part of their mix. So it's no longer like anecdotal, but there's a lot of real world data out there. And we've been taking data. I'm actually hoping in the next couple of years to get a published study done and with an independent university, but that's academia takes a lot of time. Mm-hmm. We were actually, with the researcher I was working with, we were actually doing a test in 2000. We started in late 2019 and they were still collecting data in March of 2020. And then that just threw the whole thing off. And we're only now getting to the point where the researcher can start to consider doing another randomized blind study. Yeah. That's just how it is. So, but we've been forging ahead, collecting data, working with athletes collaboratively, and in mostly endurance, including cycling. And over the years, we've had a lot of success across the boards in sports, from anything as short as figure skating, which we can talk about later, all the way to these ultra endurance events where they're multi-day things like RAM. I had a woman finish a solo RAM, and she had a full-time job, wasn't her day job, to train for RAM. And I don't know if people realize this, but more females have summited Everest than have finished a solo female RAM. That's how hard physiologically the RAM is for a female. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And then we have ultra runners, a lot of ultra runners and triathletes doing amazing things, like a lot of ultra runners doing multi-day stuff now and winning 100-milers or setting FKTs.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
So really this peptide that comes from this wasp extract, we're seeing it as a catalyst to help the athlete access deeper reserves of fat. Is that accurate?
It's a metabolic catalyst, yes, and it triggers a higher level of fat metabolism. And I'm going to throw a big curveball in here that we'll talk about throughout the conversation, is that I'm talking about fat metabolism, not just fat burning for energy, because one of the biggest reservoirs of glucose that an athlete can tap into for high level work is when you're properly fat adapted and you're optimizing that fat metabolism. One of the biggest reservoirs people have is gluconeogenesis in the liver.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's not really talked about, because if you're in a high carb environment, the insulin signals to the liver, it won't make ketones, it won't make glucose from liver fat. If you're metabolically fit, if you have a demand, and that demand is really high level, like threshold and surges and anaerobic, the liver will make glucose without catabolizing protein, and it'll make a substantial amount. I've had several people report back to me their glucose hits typically 150 post ride. So they'll hammer like for the last 20, 30 minutes, and then track their glucose post exercise, and they'll see this massive glucose spike.
Yeah.
And then what's happening is, in that hammering, you're signaling the body it needs pretty big demand of fast acting energy, which is glucose, and maybe oxygen's a limiting factor too. So it'll trigger this gluconeogenesis in the liver to deliver that glucose. And then when you stop, all of a sudden you stop, but then it takes about 10, 20 minutes for the signaling to ramp down that production. It doesn't happen. So then all of a sudden you get this surge of insulin. And as the faster study showed, that surge of glucose gets shunted. It's benign because it gets immediately shunted into muscle glycogen.
Right. So,
and I've had one guy hit as high as 200 post exercise, fasted. So no carbohydrates, just a Vespa, hammer at the end, and they see the big surge. So that's a really big reservoir, and young metabolically fit males are capable of that, because their testosterone will cover up a host of sins.
Dietary sins. I remember reading that in one of your articles, or seeing in one of your videos. Yeah. I love that concept.
Young males. And to a point, I remember one of the things that got me going years ago, and I don't know if it was at that camp that we met, but I remember one of the guys talking about how he tied one on, just got drunk as crap the night before a ride and had the ride of his life the next day. And that piqued my curiosity, because I was already dealing with the fructose thing. And of course we're going on these little things, but this is fat metabolism. Again, if you're properly wired to optimize your fat metabolism, fructose and alcohol can actually be your friend. And I'm not saying don't having drunk. Don't get drunk every weekend. Don't have a big gulp every time you're thirsty. But the occasional hit of fructose or alcohol when you're metabolically fit, that gets shunted into liver fat. And that's the first fat the liver will pull back off to make either ketones, glucose, or free fatty acids as metabolites for energy. Okay. And so it's just a fat. The topic is fascinating. It goes down all kinds of things, because here's the thing. It's like I said earlier, glucose is your fight or flight, to your bridge fuel, right? So these unlimited fat calories, not only do we have unlimited energy in fat calories, but fat metabolism is responsible for all your cell generating hormone enzyme processes, whereas glucose is simply that fight or flight. other than glucose metabolism, which is getting energy in now, it doesn't do a whole lot more. Whereas the whole thing about fat metabolism, which includes cholesterol, because cholesterol are fats and proteins and all kinds of other nutritional, it's very complex. And so you hear that word keto a lot in ketogenic diet. Well, that's just that's a proxy, because ketones, you can simplify it down to ketones, it's sort of reductionist. So ketones are a proxy for fat metabolism. And so you've got all these things going on with fat metabolism that make for me, it's never ending rabbit holes of curiosity and inquiry and things to think about and experiment with to get that performance and health benefit thing where we seem to be, anecdotally, I mean, we're seeing that, athletes, when they're metabolically fit, they perform at a high level, they perform consistently, and they've got longevity, and they lose a lot of the health challenges that are commonly considered as normal in a lot of sports we're doing. The trajectory of athletes, the longevity, the things like bonking, GI issues, recovery stuff, injuries that tend to develop, and everybody just accepts it as normal.
Great. So a couple things I want to ask you about. It sounds like what we're talking about, if we're thinking back to gluconeogenesis in the liver.
Yep.
We're talking about, there's several parallels I see here, but the discussion is around, are we taking it exogenously or are we creating it endogenously, right? Are we taking on lots of carbs through sugars and drinks and gels and all the things, or are we generating glucose internally through our own biochemistry?
And even ketones,
and
because
the same discussion happens.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, the same discussion applies to ketones, right? Are we making them endogenously or are we taking them exogenously? And this reminds me, give me one sec here. I'm going to pull this book out. It's actually under my computer. I was just reading this book recently. This is Body Reading by Thomas Myers, if you know who he is.
No.
So he's the guy who wrote Anatomy Trains. And this concept directly applies. It's a little more esoteric, but it directly applies to what we're talking about. We just have to find it here without murdering time. So he talks about the concept of people working from the core versus seeking from the external, right? So this is a little more esoteric, but it's the same idea.
It's philosophically aligned with my overarching philosophy.
That's why I thought I wanted to bring it up, because I figured you might tune into this based on some of the stuff I've read on your site. So Tom writes, this is page 67 of his book, which is called Body Reading. Sad but true, the fact is we are not a core culture. Now he's talking about core literally in terms of core musculature and core recruitment, but he's also talking metaphorically and metaphysically. There is certainly more awareness of core due to the work of Joseph Pilates and physiotherapists such as Paul Hodges and Diane Lee, and the call has been taken up by various and sundry modalities. But truly occupying our core is an uphill battle in a culture where perfect breasts, perfect teeth, a pleasing shape to the pecs or glutes, and imitating the cover of a lure win out over core values such as authenticity, calm, compassion, and moral strength. If this seems to be ascribing too much virtue to being core aware, I have to say, on the basis of 40 plus years in the business, no, it isn't. To live in the core, to truly inhabit it, not just to talk about it, is to experience core convictions and core strength. Based on examination of the art, ancient Egypt, Sumeria, and early Greece were core-aware cultures. But from classical times on down to the present, we have been going downhill in this regard, becoming more and more reliant on the outer sleeve muscles and values, with notable exceptions like Albert Einstein and Mahatma Gandhi, recently becoming very weak and superficial indeed. Some in the younger generation, I'm happy to say, are beginning to reverse this trend, doing amazing feats with skateboards, snowboards, kiteboards et al., and more power to them. So just all of our conversation brought me to that concept, right? So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
And this aligns with my philosophy, and we'll just go off on a little detour here. And one of the things that I think that the modern, what I call the modern human construct, not the natural world we evolved in is all about taking us away from ourselves, because we get these messaging like, oh, if you're a woman, your breasts and your ass aren't good enough.
Right.
And if you're a man, you don't have a six pack or big bulging muscles, and which I'll tell you, we'll talk about the big bulging muscles too, because that's not healthy. Anyway, I don't mean you have to be skinny, but it's like, yeah. So anyway, this is a part of my core thing. And as a starting point, one of the things I talk about a lot is creating the intuitive athlete. And that is when you're metabolically and biomechanically in your zone, your own feedback mechanism is the most powerful tool you have. It's not the only tool. However, the man-made construct has everybody saying, oh, where's the data? What's the latest shiny object, whether it's the Garmin, the ketone meter, and now the continuous glucose monitor, and people are chasing the numbers.
Yep.
And it's like, I'm a pilot, and one of the things that I compare this to is when somebody's learning to fly, the instructor will say, I climbed to 5,000 and hold 5,000 feet. And it's very well known in basic flying that, newbies will chase the instruments. And this is the same. So they'll fly up and they'll hit 5,000, they'll overshoot it, and then they'll undershoot it. And they're looking at the gauge rather than getting there and holding altitude. And it's an intuitive process, and our own feedback mechanisms in terms of biomechanics, physiology, metabolism are our best tools when we've got them working properly.
Yep.
Okay. And so people need to know that, and that unfortunately, though, everything in today's modern world is oversimplified, and it points to just one thing. So people are constantly getting distracted from recognizing they have the power within them, and they can tap into not just their energy, but their own mental and emotional and physiological feedback mechanisms to tell them how to do it. And it's like I say, the data corroborates the experience. It doesn't drive it. And this is completely opposite to the messaging that's going on out there. And a perfect example for the audience is right now this fascination with continuous glucose monitors.
Yep.
Okay. And it's a great tool. Don't get me wrong, but it's a tool to verify where you are metabolically and what's going on to help you understand and hone that intuitive sense. And so if somebody steps back and understands actual glucose metabolism and what glucose does and how it's metabolically regulated in the body, it's an absolute disaster to try to control your glucose, because when you look at fasting glucose, the ideal glucose level in your bloodstream, it amounts literally, it's very tightly controlled. And it amounts to literally 1 teaspoon of sugar as glucose in your system. You just do the math. It works out to be approximately 1 teaspoon. It's so tightly regulated. And sure, our bodies can take a jolt of insulin. They're designed for it if you're healthy, but it's not meant to be chronically assaulted with glucose like that all the time and time again. And so when people are looking at these glucose monitors, they're just chasing the numbers, just like that novice pilot who's just going up and down because it's too tightly controlled to do it. Whereas what we're finding, I've got several people now. I've got four different subjects I'm working with who are on CGMs. 2 are type 1 diabetics, and 2 are high-level athletes. One of them is my team coach, lead coach, Tony Convalan, who's a high-level age group cyclist. By the way, shout out to Tony because he's the one that got us in touch.
Oh, cool.
But anyway, what we're finding is our approach of working with getting that base energy of fat going stabilizes blood sugar, period.
Yeah. It's the foundation upon which you build
That's right.
Or the house, right?
That's correct. It's that foundation, and it's a big part of the skyscraper. Just, the glucose is the tip of the iceberg, and if you keep it at that kind of thing, it's a very powerful tip, and this is why carbs do what they do. So,
but if an athlete is dependent on that system only without building the underlying foundation, then of course they've got a sword to wield, to change analogies slightly, but that sword is not based on a solid foundation, and it won't cut as effectively. It won't have as big of a reach, right? Is that fair to say? I'm blending analogies, which might be confusing.
You could have a temporary reach, like, as a fight or flight. If you're metabolically healthy and you use that glucose metabolism for that big reach and that big ask, the body will respond then. But if you're chronically doing that, there's unintended consequences. And like I say, if you're doing a lot of carbs on a chronic basis, it's not a question of if you're going to have a problem, it's when and what form.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's when and what form.
Yeah. Of course. And if I can reverse for a second, Peter, I want to just frame the conversation in terms of human evolution, right? So it's like we have to accept there's a natural law present, and natural law dominates everything. I think people consistently underestimate this. But if we think about your conversation on, or your points on glucose being a fight or flight mechanism, right? Or also you said a mechanism of change, right? Of transition, a bridge is the term you use. And okay, so we look at the modern athlete, we look at the modern cyclist or the modern runner, and maybe they're doing by ultra standards, short events, but 4 or 5 or 6 hour bike races, or a running race of say 3 hours. So you're normally using some fat and some glycogen to fuel.
You're always using some fat and some carbs.
Right. Right.
Because you'd be dead if you weren't using any fat.
Yes. Right. But let's imagine we do a 4-hour bike race, and we look at time and zone at the end of the race, and the rider has 45 minutes at threshold and 20 minutes of glycolytic power, and a handful of minutes at sprint power, and then all the zones before that. And I'm sure you would agree, metabolic zones, we tend to use the term zones when we assign time in zone or when we're slicing up our training. But of course, all these metabolic systems blend together. That's one of the terms I prefer to use more of a thought process that's evolved around intensity spectrum rather than zones, because zones imply that there's a hard stopping point. Like at 300 watts, I'm using 100% aerobic energy. And then at 301, I'm using, 99% glycolytic energy. This is not how the body works, right? Of course.
Right.
And so they're just artificial boundaries.
Unfortunately, modern communication is reductionist.
Yes.
So it bifurcates into these like hard things rather than this more nuanced approach that we're talking about. So we have to be careful we don't lose people here.
Yes, for sure. For sure. And so if we think from an evolutionary standpoint, okay, the rider has whatever the example is, 45 minutes of threshold. That's riding your bike up or running up a mountain as fast as you can at maximal lactate steady state for 45 minutes continuously, or maybe it's a total of 45 minutes accumulated over the duration of that 4-hour race or whatever. When in evolutionary history, in nature, in our tribal existence, when did we ever have an experience of someone being at threshold for 45 minutes? This makes no sense at all. This is a demand that is exclusive to what as you said, the social constructs that we put ourselves through, because we decide bike racing is cool and running is cool. And I think they're super cool. I'm a total bike dork. Like, I've raced my bike for 35 years. But what I'm pointing out is that it doesn't match any evolutionary demands of our bodies. Like, if you're in a 60-person tribe that's hunting and gathering, we're the worst sprinters in the animal kingdom by a landslide, right? What was our evolutionary advantage? We went from quadruped to biped, took a huge risk. We had to develop our big brains so we could track animals and scan the horizon for threats. And in combination with that, we also had to have extremely good balance and a good vestibular system, because we went from a 4-point base of support to a 2-point. We also exposed our organs and our throat directly to our threats, right? Whereas a quadruped, you've got teeth and fangs facing you. So, okay, we took this risk.
But at the same time, we became the apex predator. So,
Absolutely.
it's like I tell my vegetarian friends, I've got my eyes in the front of my head, I've got
Yeah.
canine teeth and I only have one stomach.
And
So
molars, right?
yeah, and molars. And so we were stalking prey. We weren't being attacked by prey
Most
for the
of the
most
time.
part.
Right.
Most of the time, very rare.
So what was our hunting strategy? We're horrible sprinters. So we walk up to a herd of antelope and they go, oh shit. They run away. They sprint away from us. We use our brains. We use our eyes. We track them. We walk for 3 hours. Then we find them again. They sprint away from us again. And then we track them for another 3 hours. And then by that time it's 3 PM and we have sweat glands, which they don't. So we're fine. Right. And they're smoked, right? They're basically
right. And ruminants produce a lot of internal energy, thus a lot of heat. And so it's not only that we have sweat glands and they don't, but the bigger the ruminant,
the more
harder it is for them to thermoregulate.
Yep. Right. So then that's our advantages. But what are we talking? We're talking about jogging for half an hour, maybe at the critical moment of hunting, maybe jogging, because we're never going to sprint to catch up to an antelope unless, maybe for a few seconds here and there, we're surrounding them. And okay, so we get attacked by a neighboring tribe. What is that? 3-5 minutes tops of threshold or fight or flight. We get attacked by a lion, 30 seconds.
Yep.
Either you make it up a tree and he gives up or your lion snack. So you see what I'm getting at? Like, we have to remember, Marathon died. He died when he got to Marathon, right? When the guy ran.
He got to, when he got back to Marathon.
The town, which became to Marathon, right? So, right. Sorry, maybe I don't remember the guy. I was thinking the guy's name was Marathon.
It was Pheidippides.
Thank you.
Here's the thing about him, and to a point in a couple of weeks, the Spartathlon's going on.
Yep.
And so he ran 142 miles before that last 26 miles. And that's what the Spartathlon, it retraces his original thing where he was sent to go get troops and all this.
Okay.
And the last 26 miles was when he heralded to the king of Marathon the king of Sparta, that on the plains of Marathon, they'd driven the Persians back.
Interesting.
Yeah, okay. He went back and forth, and he went and supported the troops. They said he fought, but he probably wasn't a frontline fighter. Yeah. He's probably in a support role.
Yeah.
And they drove back the Persians, and then he ran to Sparta, and that's where he died. So, and I'll take this one thing further. Like everything you're saying, that I want the audience to hold on to this, because there was a study, and I can't remember the name of the author, but it was out of the University of Arizona. And this anthropologist went and studied the Hudsu, which is the still nomadic hunter-gatherer tribe of the Maasai. Mm-hmm. That's what the Maasai evolved from. Mm-hmm. And basically the study said they were on their feet all day, but it was like 90 minutes to 2 hours where they were, their physical intensity level went from low to mid and high intensity stuff, just like you're describing. Okay. And so we're pushing those limits, but we do have the robustness to do that kind of thing, like do some climbs, like sustained climbs at threshold, at a high level. It's just that when you do it on carbohydrates, the paradigm is much different than on a fat-based physiology.
Mm. So, okay, maybe you can lay out what a strategy might look like for an athlete. Like let's outline it from a practical perspective. If someone's
let's we've done a lot of talk about the whole carbohydrate thing, so we bagged on carbohydrates, and I'll do one last thing.
We can beat up on keto for a while too.
So I want to frame this. So you've got the push for carbohydrates, and I'm going to say, carbohydrates are essential for performance. They're essential for adaptation for fat metabolism. And we'll talk about this later about how important carbs are to optimize your fat metabolism.
Right.
Because this is a good segue into keto.
And
you need
you remember
carbs.
Louise Burke's paper, The Nail in the Coffin, right?
Right. And then she retracted it after the Faster study. She wrote a separate editorial piece. Maybe we...
I'd love to unpack all that. Sure. Okay.
Yeah. But anyway, to finish up bagging on the copious amounts of carbohydrates.
Yep.
A couple of things. First off is a couple of days ago, I was working with one of my coaches, and we were talking about, he sent me an article on Ironman triathlon fueling. conventional, and there's been a push to increase carbohydrates in bike and multi-sports. Huge because of the new formulations, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so I did the math, and I'm going to do a blog on it, but for a 6-month lead up to an Ironman, just conservatively, 12 hours a week, 200 calories an hour of exogenous intake, 2 gels an hour during training, and your event, that is set of high carbs, concentrated carbs, and carbs in the diet, like 300 grams a day. Anyway, that amounted to 155 pounds of sugar.
Wow.
In a 6-month lead up.
So that's 1-to-1 body weight for most people.
Right.
You're eating your body weight in sugar over 6 months.
Yeah, over 6 months. And that was fairly conservative because, as you just said, there's a big push for elite level athletes to really go. It's like, what if you can, let's not even go extreme, right? What if you can just cut a third out or half of it out?
Mm-hmm.
We all know too much sugar is bad. It's like, we don't need to cut it all out, but if you're literally eating your body weight in sugar over a 6-month period, people, it's not going to end well. And this is the push. And 99% of the people out there aren't riding in a pro peloton where they're metabolically trained up to handle that. And, and it's like, and even those guys are going to take a hit on it, but they're young and they're male and they can take the hit. So that's one thing. And then that leads to the next thing I wanted to finally say was as we like bag on this overconsumption of carbohydrates, is that, like a lot of things, nobody wants to talk, like a lot of things going on, hint, hint. Nobody wants to talk about those unintended consequences, which are well documented now in the science, in the health stats. I mean, 1 in 4 dollars of healthcare go to diabetes.
Yeah.
And then diabetes leads to things like cancer and heart disease. It's well known, which are the other two. That's the big three of the healthcare industry. And so nobody wants to talk about those things, have a conversation. They don't want to warn their people. They're just pushing the carbs. And I agree with them, but they're not willing to acknowledge, this might not end well. Right?
I mean, it makes me think of another, we'll say, paradigm that I like to explain to my athletes. Like, there are 2 parallel tracks, right? One is the lifestyle and dietary choices, the holistic choices you're making for your overall health. And then there are choices that are made for your athletic success. And I would offer and argue that anyone who's not paid a lot of money to race their bike, those 2 paths should be congruent and or parallel. Because, right, there's no argument where an age grouper should be doing crazy stuff that's going to cost them long-term health when they're making $0. They're not supporting their kids. They're not putting their kids through college. They're not buying their kids a future home. They're not setting up an estate. They're not doing any of the things that, or gaining the rewards of being an elite athlete, whatever those may be, fame and recognition or gold medals at the Olympics, right? I mean, those are all amazing goals. I went to the Olympics. It was an amazing experience. And at that time, in that moment in my life, I could see making some choices that were potentially divergent from my holistic health choices. It depends on how orthogonal they were for me to be willing to make them, right? I'm not going to dope, for example. I wasn't going to, I wouldn't saw off a leg or have a 12th rib removed. I'm not doing that stuff, just to give you goofy examples.
Yeah.
But once that path is over, then it's like those paths need to be convergent. I mean, let's be real.
Well, and here's the thing. I work with everything from elite athletes, including Olympic gold medalists, all the way down to the back of the packers, people with metabolic issues. And I'm of the firm belief that you can have both by getting back to that evolutionary model of physiology that that millions of years of research, not some stupid paper that was paid for by industry kind of state this thing. But it requires this kind of level of conversation and nuance, right? And that is because, and that's not to say that an elite athlete, like say a marathoner, I perfectly acknowledge that an elite level marathoner like going into their marathon and all that, they're going to sacrifice a little bit of their health. But here's the thing: when you take this route that of optimizing your fat metabolism, what we're focused on is building metabolic capacity so that you have the matches to burn rather than constantly taking out matches, and in your recovery, you're not quite putting back enough matches. Yep. Plus you're doing other harm, which we can talk about later. And that's what ends up why, so many athletes end up, you look at most of your ex-pro cyclists and they don't look very good. Right?
Cycling. Right. Yeah. It's not a sport that makes
one of the exceptions is Bob Roll, because Roll, he gets out and does stuff, and he's not a high carb eater. He eats a lot of meat and stuff, and he also drinks. And so his metabolic, his drinking actually supports his riding, like I mentioned earlier.
Right. Accidental, unintended consequences, perhaps.
Yeah, so, but he maintained his metabolic fitness to where he can get away with it, right? Whereas a lot of people that, like you say, that they used up a lot of those metabolic matches. But what I'm suggesting is, by getting your metabolism, because that's all optimized. We focus on the fat metabolism because that's the foundation of all your health, and that's what builds the mitochondria, the cell walls, the lipid bilayer that transits everything in and out. Those are the two key things in your cells. I'm looking at the cellular stuff because I've had conversations with Jason Koop, who's a big carb guy. He's a CTS guy. They push the carbs and they're all about that front end performance. And he one time says, "Oh, I don't look at that." And so, yeah, that's what nobody's looking at is let's start at the foundation, your cells and your base physiology and metabolism, build from there rather than that end product. And there's a lot of stuff we can talk about in terms of how that works and get there. So segueing into the whole ketone thing, the unfortunate reality of today's man-made construct and the way we communicate, things have become extremely reductionist and oversimplified. And then they've also become quite bifurcated. Like it's always one or the other, not some blend like you were talking about. It doesn't matter whether it's politics or religion or healthcare. It's like everything gets bifurcated and nobody's having a conversation. Okay. Like what's working. And so this has happened with all this sports stuff. So you got the high carb people who are, they're talking about the carbs and the performance, and there's no doubt about the performance, but they're just silent on the unintended consequences of what is essentially too much sugar in the diet and fuel. Yep. Right. And then you got the keto people who are like touting all the health benefits of keto, but they're absolutely in denial of the fact that straight keto is going to limit performance. And it's also going to limit the actual potential that fat metabolism offers. And that's why you need carbohydrate and you need intensity training. Now, keto is a good way, it's a good modality as a first step to get that base established. But I want to offer that, if you got to be on a high carb diet to perform, that's just nothing but high carbs, or if you have to be on a high fat diet to keep yourself from being metabolically unfit, you got other things to be working on.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. There are layers to the onion.
People become so focused on those one things, like I got to have my carbs. Like people, they become physiologically addicted, so they got to have their carbs to perform. And that means there's a metabolic problem there. Same thing with keto. If you look at 30 grams of concentrated carbohydrates or a teaspoon of sugar and you're crapping your pants,
right?
That's not metabolic. That's not metabolic fitness. I'm sorry. You need to build the metabolic capacity to have the latitude to be able to occasionally have something, take a hit of junk food, and it's not going to wreck you.
This is such a great point, Peter. I'm glad you made this. If I can rephrase a moment, how I think about this is, I think in our modern culture, so many people are so lost and they're so unhealthy and they look for the solution, right? So maybe they're eating the standard American diet and then they discover keto. And if you're eating the standard American diet, I'm talking about like Wendy's and Taco Bell and crap like that is not actually
Right
food.
there.
Complete garbage, right?
Yeah.
If you're eating that stuff and you go to keto, you're going to feel amazing, right? Or if you go vegetarian, you're probably going to feel amazing for a period of time. And then as your body continues to heal and you get rid of all the processed crap that you had in your system, which might take 6 months or 2 years, depending on how much crap you had in your system and how strictly vegetarian you go and what the exact outcome is, then there's a point where probably for most people, not always, but probably many people will start to feel a bit empty and they'll start to miss some things that the vegetarian diet isn't giving. I'm not here to beat up on vegetarian. I'm just using this as an example.
Yeah.
And so our diet, people are looking for an end point, but the reality is that people's metabolism and their health evolves, right? If they're paying attention and they're not dogmatic.
It's a very dynamic process. It's a moving target.
Right. So when we have these dogmatic perspectives about things, I think the point I'm making is it's quite dangerous to sit on the pedestal. This is, if you've ever read the not uncontroversial author Carlos Castaneda, he talks about the 4 errors of man, right? And the second error of man, the first is fear, and the second is knowledge. And the error is, I learned all this stuff. Let me sit on top of this rock and I'm going to tell you all the things that I know and all the things you don't know. This is a challenge, right? This is a problem.
It's hubris.
Of course it is, right? And we can, then eventually you keep learning more and you realize how little you know. And then you enter the world of Dunning-Kruger and and then you get spit in that washing machine, which is where I feel like I've been for many years. So,
but that's the problem today, is because our communication modalities have evolved to this whole online 724 thing.
Yeah.
And people are just, now it's devolved to this very primitive state of shouting who's the loudest, who has the simplest, easy to grasp soundbite science that people can glom onto and are very reactive rather than a thoughtful way.
Yeah.
Right. That's very important. And then, and it's off to the races. And like I say, when you think about it, when you stop and think about it, modern technology is pinging some very primitive fight or flight hardware in our bodies, and not just the dopamine, but just the whole thing, the cortisol, everything, in ways it was never meant,
of course,
to do. Right.
This is the story of technology, right? We invent this new amazing thing and we have all these unintended consequences. It happens every time we bring out new technology.
That's right. There's always unintended consequences. And it has the promise of making human life better, advancing us, etc. But unfortunately, without addressing those, being cognizant and cogent about how to mitigate the unintended consequences, very often, most often in terms of execution, it ends up not really good.
Right.
And so that's part of that conversation. So, if we can establish that, let's not just bag on the vegans and vegetarians, let's bag on the carnivores. If you have to be on a diet where you're eating 2 to 4 pounds of meat every day, and you're coming and you're talking to a guy who, if you put a 24-ounce porterhouse in front of me, I will eat that 24-ounce porterhouse without blinking an eye. Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. So I know I've got a bias towards that. So it appeals to me, but stepping back from that, it's like, if you have to do that to remain healthy and not have, you need to be working on some other things like building your stomach and gut.
Yes.
To be able to process other food sources, because while our digestive tract, and by the way, just for the audience, just so they know, because I got accused of not knowing anything the other day. I have a degree in plant science from UC Davis. And so it's a biology degree. Even though it's plant science, all my basic ed the first 2 years was having me getting clobbered by the pre-med, pre-vet students. So I retained enough of the biochem, physiology, anatomy, all that stuff, and the processes to somehow, by total randomness, arrive at doing what I'm doing. It's become a very useful tool that I had this. I know that without that education, I wouldn't have it. But Well, where was I?
Well, okay. If I might, I just want to reemphasize the point you were making about carnivores versus vegetarians or vegans, and the dots I wanted to connect there were simply that I think a lot of people believe that the end point of their diet is some monastic existence where they never eat a gram of sugar or a pizza or a steak or a huge salad, right? Depending on what your belief system is. Yeah, or
exactly.
plant, whatever. And that's the end point of true dietary health, is to stay in a center of relatively healthy choices, but also not be destroyed by going out for a slice of pizza with a friend or having a beer or eating a giant salad. Like if you can't tolerate those things, it's the same as on Bike Fit, right? If we move your saddle up or down 3 millimeters and your knee flares up immediately, this is simply a sign that you are nowhere near durable enough as an athlete. We need to improve your durability. We need to make you harder to kill.
Yeah.
That's the objective, right? That's true health, hard to kill.
Right. And so part of the reason I wanted to qualify my educational background that gives me the tools to do this well, I'm not just somebody who just kind of started scouring the internet, okay, is that when you look at an anatomy survey across mammal species, and this is through a conversation with a UC Davis researcher who was doing anatomy work at the veterinary school. The anatomy, the digestive tract of a human, and this is just plain facts. This is not even really debatable because this is how we are. Our digestive tract is much closer to a dog's than a pig's. Pigs and bears are what I would consider true omnivores. We are omnivorous carnivores. Okay, we're acid digesters, meaning we have a very low pH in our stomach. We use bile. Once the acid breaks things down, the bile emulsifies it. We have this appendix, which is really a remnant pouch of a cecum, which is a larger pouch for bacterial reservoir, biome reservoir to colonize our colon. And the colon is where things get consumed mostly. We have a biome from our mouth, from when things enter our to where it comes out the other end. Most of the work is done in the colon to the colon, but in our digestive tract, we have a biome, and we have this appendix, which is very small relative to a cecum, which is what horses and elephants would have. And it's nothing compared to a ruminant, which has 4 different biodigesting pouches to break down plant matter, true plant matter, and get the nutrition from the biome. It doesn't get it directly from the plants. It gets from the lipoproteins, the elements, all the vitamins. It's from that magic of fermentation, which that's why it's important to develop our digestive tract, our GI, stomach and gut health, because a lot of those elements are created through that process, but we don't have the capacity like a ruminant does, or even a horse or a gorilla. Like a gorilla is a hindgut digester. Most of its nutrition comes from its hindgut. Its colon is twice the diameter and twice the length of a human colon. It doesn't have a high acid stomach. And so this is what conferred on us. These are just digestive facts. So it's very difficult when you look at the cycle of life, where we fit on that cycle of life of from the biome that's in the soil to the plants, to the ruminants eating the plants, to the predators eating the ruminants, and the scavengers, and all those different things that fit in this, what I call this grand cycle of life. We fit on that predator spectrum, and because of our brain, our erect biped, which is extremely efficient. It may not be very fast, but it's extremely efficient. And the sweat glands, and like what I call it the grand bargain, because we traded a big gut for a big brain. And as soon as we did that, we started using tools, hunting strategies, cooking. And so all those things, using tools to mash things down, cooking, all that stuff reduced our dependence on having that really big, robust digestive tract.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, we move into processed foods, but just the evolutionary act of cooking and tools. And so that reduced our dependence on having that really super robust digestive tract that other animal species below us in that food chain
Still have. Yeah.
And still have, right? So, we're to get that nutrition, like I say, and so when you compromise your stomach and gut tract, it really has some massive implications. But again, they're more nuanced. There's a whole bunch of rabbit holes we can go down there. But I want to qualify that's when you look at that, it's not even debatable where we are on that spectrum. Yes, we can get our nutrition from plants, but it's a backup system. And I follow some of the really good vegan nutritionists, and even they say you cannot get all your nutrition from plants. You have to supplement with B12. You got to get your essential omega-3s from algae. You got to get your vitamin D2 from mushrooms. And, they're very clear about this because they know where the potholes are. But, and then the other thing that's really important in this discussion of, while we're on the nutrition subject, before I go back in the keto thing, is the other aspect of it is energy balance. We get too much. We just simply get too much in the modern world.
Overnourished, right?
We're actually undernourished.
Yeah.
But overfed in
terms
of calories. Yeah. Energy balance is the energy balance is tilted to too much. So our body's constantly having to deal with too much energy, whether it's too much fat or too much glucose or whatever form we get too much, because that evolutionary model was in perfect balance. We have a hunger trigger, and it's an overarching one because it's what got us off our butts to go hunt and gather. And we need, if you look at humans today, we're so convenience oriented and addicted that we needed a really strong hunger drive to do that, because now if people can just dial their Uber Eats app, it'll be brought to their door. That's how little we have to do. Mm-hmm. And so that was in perfect balance. And now, because of the foods available, even most athletes tend to get too much because we have too much food available. We're not doing enough to balance that, but also because of our food systems have changed and all that, our nutritional balance isn't off. So I think that by not having that balance, we tend to overeat because our body's hunting for those nutritional elements. One good example I use is with our program, we really emphasize whole animal eating. Mm-hmm. And it means muscle meat, a little tiny bit of organ meat, but a lot of skin and connective tissue.
Yeah.
And you'll get some skin and connective tissue in muscle meat, but you won't get much. So you're going to eat too much muscle meat. And muscle meat, collagen-rich foods are just not eaten in modern Western culture. Whereas if you look at traditional cultures, it's part of the diet.
For sure.
And I remember years ago, I was talking with Max Testa when I first started this. This was before that camp. Mm-hmm. And Max and I were having lunch in Salt Lake, and I was telling him about this, and he says, he stopped and thought about it. He says, Peter, when I was a little boy growing up in Italy, my grandmother came and lived with us. And this is exactly how she fed us.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Mm. Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
And if you look at how even a pack of painted wild dogs or something takes down an antelope, what do they eat first? They eat the entrails first. They eat the viscera first, right?
Right.
That's the first thing. And then the brain and the eyes. And then the muscle meat, in primitive tribes, the muscle meat would be given to the dogs, the hunting dogs, as a castaway.
And a dog's anatomy can handle a higher protein load.
Right. Right. Whereas viscera contains more connective tissue, more collagen, and also a variety of substances, right? But also higher fat relative to protein in relation to muscle meat. Muscle meat is obviously higher protein, lower fat, right?
Higher protein, higher iron. But the thing is here's the thing. I really stress the collagen and collagen-rich foods. I would prefer people get their elements from food.
Yes.
Than the supplements. But most Westerners won't eat it. But when you look at these traditional cultures, collagen-rich foods are just part of the diet.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter where you
Yeah.
go, like Mexico, like I eat typically, because I live in California, I eat menudo con pata sin grano, which is menudo, tripe soup with the hoof or the joint without the hominy. I eat that every weekend because it's available every weekend. It's a bomb. It's literally a bomb. And there's a good caldo de res would be also good. But then occasionally I'll go to a Vietnamese place and get pho with extra tripe and tendon, right? And I know in Eastern Europe, and even like Max Testa was saying, Italy, they eat a lot of tripe. They used to. The traditional Italians eat a lot of tripe. But you go to Eastern Europe, there's a name for tripe soup in every country. In Poland, it's flaxseed. In Romania, it's berta. It's a form of borscht in Russia. And so, it's getting this collagen-rich food. And then back to this energy balance thing. When you get the energy balance in place, the amount of food you need to eat, you become so efficient that it's scarily small, and to a point of sustainability for people who are leaning on the plant-based thing.
Yep.
The amount of animal products you really need to eat becomes so small, it's scary. So it becomes more sustainable. And like, if you're concerned about sustainability and being natural, source your animal products from sources you want to, like humanely raised beef, all that. I'm too poor to do that, so I shop the loss leaders in the supermarket.
Okay.
Right? Because they put meat on sale as a loss leader. Produce in season and meat, poultry, and sometimes fish are put on as what they call loss leaders. They sell them at cost because that gets people in, and then they buy all the stuff in the inner aisles that's carbohydrate rich and profitable.
Like Chips Ahoy or whatever. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but that's the thing. If you're carnivore and you're eating all this meat, it's not gonna. It may be a lot healthier than eating garbage, but that's a lot of energy. It's a lot of nutritional density, and as we're learning, because all of a sudden fasting has become a thing. We've been doing this for years, but autophagy is real. I mean, you need that cell cleansing. You need those times of feasting and fasting, and that's another thing I really think of as I've thought about this with that grand bargain of trading a big gut for a big brain. We figured out really quickly that following the great ruminant herds would provide a stable food source. It took a lot to get, it took some risk, but there wasn't feasting and famine for most humans. There were sporadic, isolated events, but most humans started to follow the fisheries and the ruminant herds to have that stable food supply. But it took a lot of energy to get, process, and all that to consume that, right? And I think that's also why we were so successful, because of our bipedal existence and all that. As populations grew and tribes got pushed further out, they followed different herds, and you see that migration out of Africa into Central Asia, into Europe, and it's just following those ruminant herds, and then across the land bridge, across the ice bridge into Alaska and all that. It's just
following food. Yeah.
All following the food and having that, just knowing, we just knew that would be a stable source. And, you see this in people like the Inuit and Eskimos today. The Laplanders still practice there's isolated people who live exactly this way. So, it's just that's one of the things in terms of the sustainability. When you get your nutrition right and your metabolism right, we become remarkably efficient, and the amount of food you need to eat and how well you manage your hunger becomes really pretty seamless, because you're burning the energy source you're meant to burn, which is your limitless one.
Yeah. So, okay, if we focus a little more on the keto athlete, I think what you're saying is that basically both polarities, both extremes, either complete carb dependence or complete keto dependence, have their pitfalls, have their challenges, right? And what you're
both of them have these pitfalls, right? And so keto. So let's go to the keto thing. Health benefits are starting keto, like you say, starting from a sad diet, sad lifestyle.
Yeah.
Going keto is like a miracle, but it's not the end point. It's like I said, we have a ebook that I have to rewrite, but it's called Beyond Keto. It's about, it's called Beyond Keto. And so for that reason, because everybody knows anecdotally that if they go deep keto, they can go all day, but they don't have a few extra top gears, right?
Well, okay, glycolytic metabolism runs on sugar, right?
That's right. It's more
It's a
than, and it's more
fact.
than that. Yeah, yeah, it's a
Okay.
fact. And this is the problem. When you go into deep keto, because you're changing that substrate to an extreme
Mhm.
to fat. And again, keto is a proxy. It's a proxy for beta oxidation, which is the true fat metabolism.
Right.
When you go deep keto, you downregulate the pyruvate dehydrogenase pathway. That's an enzyme, PDH enzyme, that is critical for quick access to glucose for fight or flight modality. So even if you're deep keto, and even if you do pound the carbohydrates initially until you ramp up that PDH pathway, you
Yep.
can be doing all kinds of carbs, but you're not going to be able to access them to do anything. And so it's just proven that all of a
Yeah.
sudden you lose that
You lose your top end.
quickness,
You can't
lose that top
do
end.
you can't jam up a super short hill. You can't be explosive. You'd have a hard time hitting VO2 max, perhaps even. Right.
Well, and that's where I was going, is not only
Okay.
that, not only do you not have that thing, but this is where optimizing fat metabolism is as much about using carbohydrates as a tool, because like I talked earlier about generating glucose from fat in your liver.
Mhm.
Well, using carbs strategically, as we say,
Yep.
creates the adaptive stress to push yourself. We don't downregulate with OFM. We don't downregulate the PDH pathway. We use that
Mhm.
with strategic carbs to get that adaptive stress. Because every time you push harder and you can push in those other limits, as long as you're not doing it chronically,
Mhm.
and on that fat basing foundation, you're creating an adaptive stress, and you're signaling to the cells they got to get stronger, more robust. They've got to build more mitochondria. You're signaling to your endothelium, your cardiovasculature, that it needs to become more distensible so we can move more plasma, more blood, more
Yep.
oxygen in, more CO2 out, more plasma to the skin surface to sweat and thermoregulate. You're signaling all these things that you can't do on keto. And then that, again, it allows you to perform on, really get the most out of the carbs for the least amount. But it also, by using the carbs, it also increases your fat metabolism. So just like how fat can be used for carbs can be used to increase your fat metabolism.
Right. I think of it as the spark. The carb is like the spark that gets the fat engine going. Is that a good analogy?
It's more than that. It is,
Okay.
but it is, but it's way more than that. It's like, the concept of duality, yin yang, how
Yeah.
two seemingly opposite things need to coexist to have that real harmony and get the best performance.
Yes.
I think people need to really understand that in this bifurcated and culturally divided world we live in.
Yeah.
That's a tough one for a lot of people to grasp onto, the yin yang, the concept of duality.
I think,
Yeah.
okay, two questions then. One is, Matt, let's do a thought experiment. Let's imagine that we had a normal athlete who was eating some carbs and having collagen and some fats, and then they decide they want to go keto, and they go strict keto. So day one, they go to 48 grams of carbs or less per day, and they do that for X number of days, however many, 30, 60, 90. In your opinion, maybe you can't say this, but in your opinion, about how long would it take for that PDH enzyme to be downregulated to the point where when they did have a plate of pasta, nothing would really happen and they'd kind of be grinding their wheels?
Probably within about 60 to 90 days.
Okay.
Because when we build back up, when we do our adaptation phase, and this was a conversation I actually had with Steve Finney, who's one of the foremost researchers in the keto sphere.
Yeah.
We figured that the adaptations to get the performance took 2 to 3 months. So I would conservatively say that's probably where it is. And like, usually to make that switch, unless you're really metabolically wrecked, somebody who's reasonably healthy, they might feel off for 2 or 3 days, or they might even feel bad for 2 or 3 days when they're restricting carbs. And then they'll feel that switch of foundation. And then that's the time you get it. You build their aerobic capacity on a fat burning base. That combination is really important because this is where, like, the bodybuilders, the gym rats, and a lot of cyclists go wrong, is they're looking for that end performance thing, your FTP, your time trial,
max, whatever.
and instead of taking the slow build, and establishing that fat-based foundation without downregulating PDH, and then building aerobic capacity, because this is one of the things I've sat back and thought about. It's like, okay, we want to build really good muscles, right? To be powerful and have endurance. So why don't we first optimize the feeding system, the cardiovasculature, the heart, the veins, the arteries, the capillaries, the capillary beds. And this is because people tend to go for those immediate gains, we're not paying attention to that. So you get that fat-based physiology, so you're burning fat as your primary fuel, and you take away all that inflammation from carbs and insulin. So all of a sudden, the cardiovasculature is much more distensible, which means those pipes can be a lot bigger volume, so you can pump more plasma. And so that is critical. And a lot of people that are probably listening to this, if they're in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, and they're serious recreational cyclists, they need to work on that. I mean, this is why, Grand Tour riders can do so well, is they're young, they're male, and they've built that aerobic fitness up, and they're still good fat burners. But somebody who's, becoming carb sensitive and, has some other markers like their insulin's going up, they need to do a metabolic reset and then build that aerobic base first. And then so it's going out and pushing the duration initially, but as soon as you can push out to what I call a golden window of like 3 hours of constant aerobic work, 2 to 3 hours. I mean, I'm just taught, then you start, as soon as you get to that level, then you can start to add in some interval and tempo type stuff to give that adaptive stress to move up. And that's building that metabolic capacity. As you build metabolic capacity and address all these items that you need to address to get your metabolism where it should be, you build that capacity, and then all of a sudden your carbohydrate tolerance increases. We've seen that time and time again, that all of a sudden you start bringing in the carbs start to work. And that's why we want to try and do that before that 60 days, like between 3 and 4, week 3 and week 4, we start to bring in carbs during exercise strategically. Like if you got to climb 5-10 minutes before that climb, take in a little bit of carbohydrate. And that's usually half, like instead of like 100 calories of gel, 50 calories, 30 calories will work really well. And you want that blood sugar spike to coincide with that extra effort. Right.
Okay. Interesting.
And then that builds that metabolic capacity. And so you got both the fat-based metabolism and the carbohydrate-based metabolism working in conjunction with each other to provide the signaling to when you go into that recovery phase, right? Rest and recovery are really important. That the body's going to build. And to a point, if you look at some of the athletes I'm working with, and especially at their age and the amount of racing they're doing, they're just basically going from race to race. They peak, race, recover, race.
So what about, we've talked about World Tour men and then age groupers needing to activate their fat metabolism a little more by maybe focusing on aerobic conditioning and riding on a reduced carbohydrate diet for a period of time. But women are inherently better fat burners than men, generally speaking, correct? And so what happens when we get a woman who's a World Tour rider? Do they have by requirement, do they have as much emphasis on that fat building metabolism? Or are they sort of wired to do that automatically? Or am I incorrect about that?
Women are like, it's like I say, with men, we're simple. I mean, literally, we're dirt simple compared to a woman. When you feed us, you bleep us, and you put us to bed. There's nothing more to it with a male. That's our priorities. Okay.
Right.
But with women, everything's complicated, from their thought and emotional process to their physiology. However, to answer your question, biologically, a woman is a hyper fat burner because a woman's physiology is made to eat and save for 2. Okay. That's their biological imperative in terms of nature's concerned. Take all the humanity out of it. A female is there to conceive, gestate, childbirth, and lactate and get that next generation on. And I hope people don't take me as a toxic male here. I'm just talking pure hard science.
Yep.
And so late gestation, so they're because they're eating and saving for two, their hunger triggers are more sensitive. They'll store more and all that. But the amazing thing about a female physiology is late gestation, childbirth, lactation. Those are periods where the female is impaired at hunting and gathering, and you can't, in mammal species, you can't depend on the male to be around to provide for you. You have to be a self-sufficient unit, going back to our earlier conversation about that intercourse self, and that's just self-sustaining thing. So they become hyper fat burners. And to a point, one of the things that got me thinking about this whole thing is I've had some really fascinating conversations with dairy nutritionists, because ruminant nutrition is like, when it comes to the biome and nutrition in the biome, because the biome's a big topic, right? Right.
Huge.
They're 50 years ahead of us, because that's how a ruminant gets its nutrition and calories, is through the biome. But anyway, fascinating conversations that got me really thinking about this with a female is because of the breeding and production schedules of modern dairy cows, they treat a female cow as a female, right? They're treating dairy cows like an elite athlete. Just the metric is milk production, and they're pushing those. And so what happens is, because of the breeding and the feeding and the push for that milk production, what happens is when a cow calves, they have to, the dairy has to manage that cow very carefully, because as soon as she calves, she'll go into this hyper state of ketosis. And if you don't manage her right to keep her from going hyper keto, she will literally take all the reserves in her body and put it into milk production for that.
Right.
And that got me thinking, because I remember when I first went to Central America in 1985 on a motorcycle. I mean, if you ever saw the Motorcycle Diaries, that was me in 1985.
Okay.
I don't know if you ever saw that movie.
No, I'm familiar with it, but I've not watched it.
Yeah, the Motorcycle Diaries. Watch it. You'll like it.
Okay.
Anyway, I remember seeing young women who had a couple of kids, and then they had one on their breast, and literally they looked like that dairy cow who went into hyperketosis. It was literally the body had gone into hyper fat metabolism.
Yep.
To feed the next generation. And then that's where, males are like in the insect species, males are expendable after the seed is planted. Females are expendable after the children are old enough to fend for themselves.
Right.
So females are hyper fat responders, and because there's a spectrum in femininity, and there's actually a spectrum in males, but it's a much narrower spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And then every once in a while, you have that very rare thing where somebody is born with unintended testes. It doesn't quite make that jump, but you have a spectrum of females. And so depending on that and a whole bunch of other things, the profile of their biome, antibiotic use, stress levels, a woman is, it really depends. It's a very complex dependent thing, but women, so you kind of have to, with a woman, it's all about I'll just say it this way. It's all about the seduction. You have to trick the body into saying, hey, it's okay. I can let go of the fat.
Right? So they don't harvest it or retain it too much. They can use it for fuel. Is that what you mean?
That's right.
Okay.
So, and as to a point, when they look at female performance, like one of the things I've really looked at carefully is like a woman's performance can be diminished anywhere from 5 to 40% from mid-luteal through menses, because that's the time when the egg dies, it's no longer viable, and the uterus to get rid of that egg and all that, the lining of the uterus becomes very inflamed, and that's how it sheds the lining, which leads to menses. And so that affects performance. But depending on where that woman falls on that spectrum, and what she's eating, what she's stressed about, how much she's exercising, at what intensity level, that can have all kinds of impacts on her fat burning, on her performance, and of course on her moods, right? That special time of the month. And so it's just, so in terms of females, I work with a lot of female athletes, and it's always I learned so much because it's an up level of a Rubik's Cube with female athletes in terms of it, but it can be done. And the female athlete should not get so much, even though she's competing, she has to be in herself, meaning, okay, I want to get to my potential, not the potential I need to beat somebody, because there's like, you look on the spectrum of females and there's some females who look like guys, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have hips. You know, they have big shoulders. I mean, it's just the physiology of that spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just better. They're going to be better fat burners and athletes in a lot of ways. So it's like, there's a whole bunch of strategies a woman who's, say, in the middle of that spectrum can use to compensate for that. Right.
Or take advantage of her strengths. And
exactly.
I mean, it's the same task for any coach, is to know the athlete really well. And it's the same task for any athlete, is to know themselves very, very well and understand their limitations and their strengths and
be comfortable with that, because it's a very unique thing. Right.
Yeah.
So women have the potential to be hyper fat burners no matter where they on the spectrum, but there's no cookie cutter to get all women, one path to get all women to turn their fat switch back on.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, cool. So, I have another question for you, and maybe this will parlay into some more discussion, but you're talking a lot about how, to go back to carbs for a moment, when we're ingesting, insane amounts, 155 pounds in 6 months of sugar to train for an Ironman, for example, if you're training 12 hours a week, that sugar ingestion is going to have a lot of implications, right? It's going to have a lot of potentially insulin manufacturing and a lot of inflammation, those types of things. But also, the insulin response is blunted during really hard moments of training and racing, right? So if you're doing intervals and you're slamming gels, you don't get an insulin response then, because it's right into the furnace.
Yes and no. It depends on where you're on the spectrum, right? If you're insulin resistant, yes, it's going to be blunted, but it's going to be more than somebody who's highly insulin sensitive and has low insulin.
Okay.
Right. That blunting of the insulin, and to a point, like one of the ways I've thought about this a little bit, but how a lot of the ketone esters, they have to take them with carbohydrates in bike racing to get the punch.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. That's part of the reason they do that, is because when you take the carb, you get the insulin response, however muted it is. You still get that insulin response, and insulin drives the ketones and the glucose into the cells.
Yeah.
Because if you take a ketone ester in a no carb environment,
it doesn't go into the cell.
It doesn't really increase performance. You might be able to go longer, but you don't get that pop. But when you take in a ketone ester and then give yourself a hit of carbs, it's like, wow, you got two more fuels coming in from the outside.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I've played with ketone aid, the KE4 a bit a few years ago. And just to understand it and experiment. And I found I had good results with it largely, but I'll say two of my challenges were, one, it violated one of my principles of health, which is don't eat anything refined, right? As a general rule. Now I'm not orthogonal. I'm not orthorexic about that rule, but I don't eat a lot of processed foods at all. And I avoid certain foods are toxic to me and kryptonite for me. So I just don't eat them, things like ding dongs and McDonald's and stuff. I haven't had fast food in well over a decade. Twinkies, all that crap. So the ketone aid violates one of those principles immediately, because when you put it in your mouth, if you've never had it, there's nothing less natural in the world that I can think of. Just about it's the most synthetic, weird, oily, watery substance, and so you taste it and immediately it's like, I was taken aback by it. I was like, wow, this is I've
never had it, but just knowing the formula from my OCAM days in high school and college, it's like beta hydroxybutyrate. This is like what they use to cover fabric airplanes.
Right.
Butyrate dope. Right. And it smells like butyrate dope.
Yes. Yeah.
And like I've got in my shop, I've got methyl ethyl ketone and all that stuff, and that's what it reminds me of, is all these solvents that we use.
So I'm telling people, I'm I'm a hippie. Like I tell people, if especially just yesterday, I had 2 conversations with athletes about saddle sores, and they're both telling me, yeah, I use alcohol and all these extreme soaps. I'm like, you got to stop doing that. You're killing your biome. You need to use, I recommend Dr. Bronner's. I'm a hippie, man. I use natural soaps, lotions. We have to let the biome heal. And so it's the same
But
principle.
we got to get you to inoculate yourself with Nitrosomonas eutropa then. Yeah.
Tell me.
Oh, this is part of my OFM stuff, but it's one of the more esoteric sections. Years ago, I inoculated myself with Nitrosomonas eutropa, which is Nitrosomonas bacteria are endemic to the environment. And they exist principally in geyser pots where there's a lot of sulfur and stuff, and where animals urinate. So when you look at a horse or a giraffe or a hippopotamus or an elephant dusting themselves, they're dusting themselves essentially where they've been peeing. And it's because the Nitrosomonas bacteria are ammonia oxidizing. They're not carbon oxidizing, they're ammonia oxidizing bacteria. But because of that, they're slow growing and they don't compete well. They need a high ammonia environment to do that. And our sweat has ammonia in it, has nitrogen compounds. And so what it does is it converts the ammonia that's in our sweat into nitric oxide, which is a potent vasodilator.
Yes.
So it helps your skin be better,
clearer,
but also at the same time, it totally does away with the ammonia smells, and then the downstream, even worse smells you get by getting in everything else and fueling other bacteria. So it won't take care of the sweat gland smell, but it will take care of, like I used to go for these lunchtime runs in the Central Valley where it'd be 90, 100 degrees, and I'd come back and smell like I urinated on myself.
Yeah. I know what you mean.
Right?
There are athletes who come to my fit studio and I have the same experience. Yeah.
Right. And usually they're on high protein meat diets because they have a lot of nitrogen they're excreting. You won't get that so much with a vegetarian unless they're eating a ton of protein, because protein uses an amine, which is a nitrogen compound.
So would this technique be useful for someone who has challenges with gout or increased uric acid levels?
Not so much internally, but that's part of the whole thing. Like I inhale it. I inhale it through my nostrils to help colonize my your
biome,
the biome that's in my airways, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot of strategies. There's a ton of strategies you need to use to increase endogenous nitric oxide, but this is topical nitric oxide for the most part.
Yep.
But it's critical, like when you're talking about that, but you can't use the commercial soaps. Like I use Castile soap, and I use for the shampoo, I use a body wash, the Honest body wash that you find in the baby section at Target.
Yeah.
It doesn't have
very natural.
It doesn't have the chemicals that kill this Nitrosomonas bacteria. Your standard soaps, including Ivory, will kill it.
Oh yeah.
Basically what we've done is we've sterilized our bodies.
Yes. This is the point. I make this point all the time when I talk to people about saddle sores, and then they ride in their kits for 2, 3, 4 hours. They put their kit in a hamper immediately. So it sits there for 4 or 5 days, just growing whatever it's growing, right? And then they go get in the shower and they nuke their system with these soaps that are way too strong. And then they probably aren't nourishing their skin with any kind of healthy.
Well, and if they're on a high carb diet, when they're on a high carb diet, they don't get the blood flow to the skin cells like they should because of that inflammation, and because they don't have the Nitrosomonas bacteria there creating the nitrous oxide.
Interesting.
Like I found, since that, all kinds of subtle, it's anecdotal. I know, the science nerds out there will attack the lack of science, but my skin breathes well, I sweat better, I don't stink, but and I don't have I heal well from minor cuts and bruises, and I'm old, I should be not healing well. And so,
in theory, and based on
but this is part
the normative observation.
Right. And so this is just like, we go back to that cycle of life. This is part of the endemic biome in the soil that's there as part of our cycle, that animals do it. And the discovery of this for human application and they're doing clinical trials in wound healing. The company doesn't produce the product for consumers anymore, and I'll show you how to do it. But their main goal was to monetize it through patenting as a medical thing for wound healing and all that, because it creates that breathing and blood flow. And this is really important because I think the whole fear of skin cancer has to do with lack of nutrition through a high carb, low fat diet. The fear of the sun, right? And then you add to that low vitamin D, low exercise level, and then you end up with a bunch of problems. So this is a critical bacteria that needs to be, colonized on our skin. Once you have it colonized, like I still have a little bit of the stuff left, and I'll start buying it because you can buy it for as a soil amendment.
Okay.
But I don't colonize myself. I mean, once a month, I may spray a little bit somewhere, but once it's colonized, I don't need to. It's not that I start smelling bad. It's just that, okay, I got a little spritz a few thing here as a booster, but I've been colonized for like 7-8 years, and it's just been fantastic. So that's when you talk about the skin stuff, but see, I told you we are going to get down rabbit holes.
This is great. I love it. I'm so happy, Peter. Thank you. And that reminds me of the Jack Cruz podcast, which I brought up to you in an email, and I guess you had someone else send you that podcast as well from Dr. Jack Cruz. And just to catch my audience up, this is a conversation that happened on Rick Rubin's podcast. Rick is a music producer. In case you don't know, he's produced every band that you probably ever know. 9 Inch Nails, U2, et cetera, Snoop Dogg. So he's a massively famous guy, but he started this podcast recently, and he's friends with Dr. Andrew Huberman, who's a neurologist, a well-known neurologist who has his own show. And Dr. Cruz has been basically slaughtering Huberman on Twitter for a few years now because he's convinced that Huberman is missing some really important basic things.
He's totally,
his teachings.
He and so much of the online gurus are missing. They're missing the whole point. I'll say it. Jack Cruz. I've been following Jack Cruz for years. The guy is brilliant. Brilliant. The problem is he's talking 5 levels above everybody.
Agreed. And it's hard. People confuse that with ego at times, which is one of the biggest challenges. They're like, this guy thinks he's the world's biggest know-it-all. It's like, well, he's talking 5 levels above most other people. So from that perspective, he is, but it doesn't mean he's full of ego. But yeah.
Whether he is or not,
Who cares? Just learn from him.
I had all these classes in quantum physics at Davis, and it's like I took physics, university physics, and they were talking about the stuff at the time because that's what was researched way back in the 80s, when it's late 70s, early 80s, where I was in school, and that was a big topic. And then, of course, as studying plant science, well, how do plants get their energy? From sunlight.
Right.
Boom. Right. And then we and so everything he's talking about is there's relevance, but it's hard for people to connect that. They're looking at that. Okay, A goes to B, Jack's going, A goes to C to B to E, and then eventually ends up here. And people just, with this soundbite science we're being fed these days, and this focus on studies, published papers, looking at one thing, Jack's talking about this cohesive model tied to like things like light. And that brings me to a real good point. One of the key things I learned early on in this journey of fat metabolism was that vitamin D levels were crucial for performance level fat metabolism. It wasn't just a diet. It was, you had to get, so I have what I call Peter's vitamin D reference range, and because the medical reference range is pathetic, and I'll explain why. It ranges, depending on which one you look at, it's either 20 to 30 micrograms per deciliter up to 100. So 20 to 30 to 100 is the medical reference range. Well, my reference range is like anything below 40 is deficient. 40 to 50 is suboptimal, but it's not bad. And then you really need to be 50 to 80. You can go higher. We have athletes go real high all the time, but it doesn't seem to affect them one way or another, but like to keep that in that 50 to 80 range. And in the last 3 years, there's been a lot of studies coming out about serious viral infections, and it's pretty clear if you're vitamin D, if you're metabolically fit and your vitamin D is 50 or above, your chances of having a bad viral infection are
way
lower,
Yeah.
essentially zero. But in science speak, they say it's really low.
Right.
And so there's a lot of benefits to that. It helps with hunger attenuation. It helps with inflammation. It helps for fat burning capacity. I mean, you can't get somebody to burn fat if they're low vitamin D. And what I think established those really low reference ranges was all developed in the days of industrialization before refrigeration became common in the household. Right? So people were eating, a lot of their diet was what Weston Price calls foods of modern commerce. So shelf-stable foods, high in carbohydrates. They were living in urban environments. And so that was all developed during the age of industry, where people were inside, poor diet, and the rickets, the pellagra, the preeclampsia, all the diseases. But because their diet was so poor, they couldn't give them too much because their metabolism wouldn't handle the higher vitamin D loads. And so that 20 to 30 was just enough to get them asymptomatic of the disease states, the symptomatic disease states, but it was far from getting them to the metabolic health state.
Actual health.
You have the robustness, resilience, and the ability to burn fat instead of your fight or flight fuel. So that's another key thing. And so, and then you think about it, and I read a lot from Michael Hollick, a lot of the studies that Michael Hollick did, and he wrote a book. He's the foremost researcher in vitamin D. But when you think about it, most people in northern latitudes don't get any vitamin D from UVB in the winter. And we live in mostly indoor environments under artificial light. And, if you're out there in the midday sun, like from an evolutionary standpoint, as a hunter or gatherer, you're getting hundreds of thousands of IUs of vitamin D each day. And as a point, you look at how humans evolved at the tropical latitudes, darker skin because they were getting blasted with sun all year round. And then as you move to the higher latitudes, lighter and lighter skin because you had that 2 or 3 month period where you had to get all you can get and store it up. And that's how, skin tones evolved. Okay. And another point, back to the women saving and eating for two. This is why in certain types of people, from a certain group, wherever they basically evolved, the women always have lighter skin tone.
Interesting. Because they were hunting and gathering less.
Well, they're hunting and gathering less, and also they had to save up more vitamin D.
Okay. More melanin.
For the building of another body.
Right. That makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, I love it. Hello there, Space Monkeys. You've made it to the end of our discussion, or at least the first half of the first discussion. And we're going to give you some options to try out some Vespa with spectacular savings. So thank you to Peter and the team at Vespa for making this available to the audience. There are 2 options. Both of them involve clicking on a link, and one involves a code. I'm going to tell you the link because you can probably just type it in and get there. It's vespapower.com/coupon/alignment25. 25 is spelled in digits. It's not spelled out in alpha characters. / So yes, there's a / at the end of that. One more time. That's vespapower.com/coupons/alignment25 /. In order to use that coupon, you will enter the code alignment25. That's in all lowercase. You have to know how to spell alignment correctly because we did. So you got to spell it right. So the code is alignment25. That gets you 25% off your order. There's also a sampler pack that Vespa can offer you. And it's $40 worth of free Vespa products to try, but you have to pay shipping, which is normally $20. So there you go. It's $20 worth of product. You're paying $20 for $40 worth of product, and you get free shipping is another way to think about it. And in order to activate that offer, you'll want to go to the link in the show notes. So we will put both those in the show notes. Go forth and check it out. As you know, I only recommend products that I've tried myself and believe in, and Vespa thus qualifies. And before you go thinking that I'm financially benefiting from this relationship, I'm not. I'm not getting paid to sell you guys Vespa. So that's my transparency statement on that. Go forth and enjoy. You'll want to read on their website about how to use it. There are also some instructions that are included with the product. And let me know what you think. If you have good experiences with Vespa, come tell me on the Instagram or tell them. If you have bad experiences or confusing experiences with Vespa, also tell us and we can discuss, because this will not normally be the case. Thanks for listening. Pedal consciously as always. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Epilogue. I want to share a few brief thoughts about the inception of cycling and alignment. The purpose of this podcast is for me to get 3.5 decades of hard-fought lessons out of my skull. Some of them through my own research and reading. Some of them I've been taught through mentors and colleagues, other riders, other racers. A lot of it, a massive amount of it, was simply trial and error through my own stubborn methods. And that has amassed a certain amount of experience and knowledge, understanding. And while I think I'm reasonably smart and I know quite a bit of stuff, I want to make it clear that the opinions that I share on this podcast are belief systems built on what I've experienced to this point. And that some of those opinions are pretty strong, but they are also loosely held. That is to say that if I learn more about a topic and have a greater level of clarity or understanding, then my old belief systems will be abandoned and I will now operate under that newfound knowledge. So I'm not here to tell people all the things that I know. I'm here to explain what I've learned to this point. And there's a big difference. Also, that is the intent when I discuss things on the pod with guests, is to learn from them and have a discourse. Because if we can't have a discourse as adults, then we've lost one of the basic tenets of modern society. Even if we disagree, we ought to be able to, in most cases, shake hands and walk away. Because after all, this is sport we're talking about, and while sport is training for life, it's nothing to get too upset over. The purpose of the podcast is to help me help other people, and specifically to help them actualize their highest potential by illuminating a path that enables alignment with their truth, their intent, and their coherence. That's really the end goal. So I'm grateful for your listening. My intent is also not, to be clear, to gain an audience or become popular or gain social status in any way. I don't care about that stuff. That said, if you feel an episode that you have heard will help someone you know, please share it with them. That helps us reach the end goal, which is to help more people. Thank you for listening. I'm grateful for your time and attention. Blessings.